Donald Trump has always trusted noise as a legal tactic. If you yell long enough, loudly enough, and in enough directions, eventually the space fills with sound and the question vanishes. For decades that method worked for him. Lawsuits, threats, denials, counterpunches, everything everywhere, all at once. Reality to Trump was never something to face. It was something to wear down. And yet, within the span of only 24 hours, he managed to achieve something unusual, even by his own standards. He didn't just drop the bar. He tunneled beneath it. Stephen Colbert's show that night didn't begin with sirens. It never does. It started with the familiar cadence of late-night ease. The gentle illusion that nothing serious is about to unfold. A joke here, a smile there. The audience settled in, expecting satire, not indictment. That expectation was the snare. Colbert began where Trump always begins, with denial. Clip after clip played. Trump on the South Lawn. The roar of Marine One swallowing half his words. Flicking a hand as if brushing off dust. I wasn't a fan. I hardly knew him. Everyone in Palm Beach knew him. Each line precisely designed to lessen closeness, to shrink connection, to make Jeffrey Epstein sound like background static instead of a presence. It was a masterclass in minimization. Not innocence, distance, not ignorance, casual familiarity. Trump didn't deny Epstein existed. He denied significance, and significance is everything in scandal. If you only listened to the words, the narrative was nearly believable. A billionaire crosses paths with another billionaire. So what? Palm Beach is small. Parties are packed. Photos happen. End of story. But Colbert wasn't focused on words. The president says he barely knew Jeffrey Epstein, Colbert said, and his tone shifted. Not louder, not angrier, just heavier. Let's check that. The studio lights dimmed. Not theatrically but intentionally. The massive screen behind him flickered alive, and with it the first photograph appeared. It wasn't vague. It wasn't distant. It wasn't dismissible as coincidence. Donald Trump and Jeffrey Epstein stood shoulder to shoulder at Mar-a-Lago, smiling broadly, bodies angled inward in the unconscious way people do when they're at ease with each other. This wasn't a handshake caught mid-motion. It was familiarity preserved in time. The audience responded not with laughter but with recognition. Barely knew him, Colbert repeated, letting the phrase decay beneath the image. The second photo followed. Party setting. Trump, Epstein. Women beside them. Energy, tension, comfort. This was not a man tolerating another's presence. This was a man sharing a spotlight. Whatever story Trump had told himself over the years, the image told a simpler one. These men were not strangers. Colbert didn't editorialize. He didn't have to. The photos carried the weight. He simply stood in the silence they created. Then came the third image. And the fourth and the fifth, a slideshow not of accident but of pattern. Tennis matches, galas, private club spaces, angles suggesting repeated access, not incidental overlap. Each photograph another nail in the coffin of the "I barely knew him" defense. That's a lot of photos, Colbert remarked dryly. With someone you barely know. The audience didn't laugh. They shifted. Late-night laughter depends on release, and there was none to be found here. The humor had turned forensic. But Colbert understood better than to stop at visuals. In the era of denial, images are debatable. They can be dismissed as circumstance, spun as coincidence, brushed aside as Photoshop or selective framing. A photograph can be attacked. Words are tougher. Colbert reached down to his desk and lifted a sheet of paper. No theatrics, no dramatic pause, just paper, a transcript. New York Magazine, 2002. This isn't a photo, Colbert said evenly. This is Donald Trump speaking. He put on his glasses and read. I've known Jeff for 15 years. Terrific guy. Colbert paused. Not for laughs, for time. Terrific guy, he repeated. That alone fractured the narrative. 15 years is not casual. 15 years is not barely knew him. 15 years is a relationship long enough to form opinions. Opinions Trump was now desperately trying to erase. But the quote didn't end there. He's a lot of fun to be with, Colbert continued, his voice steady, controlled. It is even said that he likes beautiful women as much as I do, and many of them are on the younger side. The studio gasped, not theatrically, genuinely. This wasn't implication. This wasn't hindsight. This was contemporaneous. Trump on record acknowledging Epstein's preferences and joking about them. Not distancing himself, not condemning, normalizing younger side. Those words didn't age badly. They were rotten the instant they were spoken. Colbert removed his glasses and stared straight into the camera. Those are his words, he said. Printed, recorded, not fake news, not AI. And in that moment the entire defense collapsed. Not under accusation, but under memory. The most dangerous thing about denial is that it leaves a paper trail. Every time Trump insisted he barely knew Jeffrey Epstein, he wasn't erasing history. He was sharpening the contrast. Each repetition raised the stakes. Each dismissal dared someone to check. And on that night, Stephen Colbert didn't argue with the denial. He let it testify against itself. The audience felt the shift instinctively. This was no longer about jokes landing. It was about credibility bleeding out under fluorescent studio lights. Colbert didn't accuse Trump of crimes. He didn't speculate about intent. He did something far more corrosive to power. He compared statements across time and let the contradictions speak in their own voice. The defense had been simple for years. I wasn't a fan. I barely knew him. We had a falling out. Simple stories survive as long as no one places them side by side with the past. But once the past was projected at 30 feet wide, the story began to fracture. Not because Colbert editorialized, but because memory doesn't negotiate. The laughter that usually cushions late-night truth was gone. In its place was an uncomfortable awareness. The audience wasn't watching comedy anymore. They were watching a timeline collapse. The images and quotes didn't accuse Trump of something new. They accused him of something older and more damaging. Lying badly and repeatedly. That's when the realization set in. Trump hadn't merely known Epstein. He had wanted to be seen knowing him. The photos weren't stolen moments. They were posed. Smiles were intentional. Proximity was chosen. People don't lean in like that to strangers. They don't glow like that next to someone they barely know. Colbert let the screen linger on one image a moment longer than the others. Trump laughing. Epstein grinning. The kind of laugh that comes from shared context, not polite tolerance. It was the kind of image Trump had once collected proudly back when association felt like status instead of liability. And that ultimately was the trap Trump had set for himself. He spent decades cultivating visibility. He wanted cameras, wanted photographs, wanted proof he was in the room. When Epstein was just another wealthy socialite, those receipts were trophies. When Epstein became radioactive, those same receipts turned into evidence. Colbert leaned into that irony without spelling it out. These aren't paparazzi shots, he said. These are invitations. The phrase landed quietly but decisively. Invitations imply choice. Choice implies agency. Agency shatters the "I barely knew him" narrative beyond repair. Then came the audience's realization that this wasn't about Epstein anymore. It was about a pattern. The pattern of retroactive distance. The pattern of rewriting proximity once it becomes inconvenient. The pattern of pretending relationships evaporate the moment accountability arrives. Trump had done this before. Business partners, staffers, allies, friends. When praise turned to scrutiny, familiarity turned to fog. I don't know him. I don't recall. I barely met the guy. It was a familiar maneuver, but never before had it been dismantled so cleanly. Colbert didn't rush. He allowed discomfort to stretch. Late-night television usually rushes to save the audience from unease. This time it refused. The silence wasn't empty. It was accusatory. It asked a question without voicing it. If he's lying about this, what else is rewritten? The genius of the segment wasn't revelation. None of the material was new. The photos had existed for years. The quote had been printed for decades. What was new was juxtaposition, memory arranged in sequence, denial placed next to documentation until one of them had to break. And denial broke first. Social media lit up within minutes, not with shock, but with recognition. People weren't saying, "I can't believe this." They were saying, "He said he didn't know him." The story wasn't Epstein. It was contradiction. The lie had finally outgrown its container. Trump's defenders scrambled. They argued semantics, knowing versus knowing well, casual versus close, social versus personal. But semantics collapse when photographs show comfort and quotes show endorsement. Language only works when people believe you're using it honestly. Colbert closed the segment without triumph. No punchline, no victory lap, just a quiet reminder. When you tell the same story long enough, eventually someone checks the footnote. And that's when it became clear this wasn't about humiliation. It was about exposure. Trump hadn't been ambushed. He had been archived. The show cut to commercial, but the damage didn't pause. The defense had finally been cornered by its own history. And history, unlike late-night jokes, doesn't fade overnight. Words are flexible. Images are not. That is the quiet terror at the center of every denial strategy. Words can be bent, reframed, walked back, or buried under new ones. Images just sit there, patient, unblinking, waiting for the moment someone finally asks them a question. Stephen Colbert understood this instinctively. That's why the segment didn't argue semantics. It didn't debate intent. It didn't speculate about what Trump knew or when he knew it. It did something far more destabilizing. It showed what Trump wanted the world to see back then and compared it to what he wants the world to forget now. Images don't accuse, they corroborate. Trump's entire public life has been built on the assumption that visibility equals power. Be seen everywhere. Be photographed with everyone. Be the loudest figure in the frame. For decades that instinct worked. Photos were proof of importance, proof of relevance, proof that he belonged at the center of elite spaces. But visibility has a cost. Cameras don't age with your narrative. They don't update their context when your story changes. They remember what you no longer want remembered. The Mar-a-Lago photos weren't hidden. They weren't leaked. They were celebrated once. They existed because Trump wanted them to exist. Because Epstein at the time was not a liability. He was another rich man in the orbit of status and access. Association wasn't dangerous then. It was currency. That's what made the denial so fragile. Trump wasn't trying to deny Epstein's existence. He was trying to deny proximity, and proximity is exactly what photographs measure best. Colbert let the images linger long enough for the audience to notice the details Trump hoped no one would revisit. Body language, comfort, repetition, the same two men together again and again across years and settings. Not accidental, not incidental, familiar. Liars hate patterns. A single photo can be explained away. 5 cannot. 10 become narrative. Patterns expose behavior, not moment. They reveal habit. They suggest continuity. And continuity is the enemy of denial. The audience understood this without needing it explained. You could feel the collective recalibration happening in real time. This wasn't about guilt or innocence. It was about credibility. The question wasn't what happened. It was why lie about knowing someone you were so visibly comfortable with. That question is radioactive. Because once people start asking why instead of whether, the entire defense changes shape. Now the story isn't Epstein. It's motive. It's avoidance. It's fear of association. Not then, but now. Colbert drove that point home without hammering it. He simply noted how relaxed Trump looked in the images. How natural, how pleased. This wasn't a man tolerating someone at arm's length. This was someone enjoying the moment, enjoying the company, enjoying the attention. And that enjoyment mattered. Because denial only works when it sounds plausible, when it aligns with human behavior. People know what discomfort looks like. They know what forced smiles look like. They know what distance looks like. None of that was present in those photos. Trump wasn't stiff. He wasn't guarded. He wasn't evasive. He was at ease. That ease became the indictment. The brilliance of the segment wasn't that it told viewers what to think, trusted them to see, to connect, to recognize the difference between someone caught in an unfortunate moment and someone documented in a long-running social relationship. That trust is rare in political media, and it's dangerous because once an audience realizes they can interpret evidence without being told what to conclude, they stop relying on narratives handed to them by power. They start trusting their own perception, and perception, once activated, is hard to shut down. Trump's response in the days that followed only deepened the damage. He didn't address the images. He didn't explain the quotes. He attacked the messenger. Fake news. Witch hunt. Hit job. The same reflexes deployed again. But something had shifted. The attacks felt reflexive, not persuasive. Defensive, not dominant. The images had already done their work. They had bypassed rhetoric and gone straight to recognition. You could see it in how people talked about it afterward. Less outrage, more resignation, tired clarity. Of course, he's lying. Not as an accusation but as an observation. That's the danger zone for any public figure. When disbelief turns into expectation. When denial stops surprising anyone. When contradiction becomes background noise. Images accelerate that process. They don't argue. They don't persuade. They remind. And reminders are brutal when your entire strategy depends on forgetting. By the time Colbert moved on to the next joke, the point had already landed. Trump wasn't being exposed as someone who knew Epstein. That was old news. He was being exposed as someone who believed he could rewrite visible history simply by repeating himself. That belief had finally met its limit. And once images become the counterweight to your words, every future denial starts on weaker ground. Denial doesn't fail all at once. It fails in layers. First, people stop believing it. Then, they stop arguing with it. And finally, they start expecting it. That's the terminal stage when a denial no longer shocks or convinces, but simply confirms a pattern everyone already recognizes. That's where this moment landed. Trump's insistence that he barely knew Jeffrey Epstein didn't collapse because of one photograph or one quote. It collapsed because the effort to erase the relationship was louder, more frantic, and more sustained than the relationship itself had ever been. Eraser, when repeated often enough, stops looking like clarification and starts looking like fear. Stephen Colbert understood that the most damaging evidence wasn't the archive. It was the reaction to it. The story didn't end with photos on a screen. It continued in how aggressively Trump tried to outrun them. Every denial added emphasis to the very thing it was meant to minimize. Every dismissal drew attention back to the question, why is this so important to disown now? Power figures rarely try to erase relationships that don't threaten them. They abandon people quietly. They move on. They don't rewrite history unless history has teeth. And Epstein had teeth. The tragedy and the exposure was that Trump's own words had already sealed the record. The 2002 quote didn't just place him near Epstein, placed him aware. Aware enough to comment, aware enough to joke, aware enough to frame predatory behavior as a shared taste rather than a red flag. That awareness was impossible to scrub away because it wasn't discovered later. It wasn't reconstructed by critics. It was volunteered freely, casually, proudly. That's why the denial felt so brittle. It wasn't just contradicting photos. It was contradicting past versions of Trump himself. Versions who hadn't yet realized they'd need to pretend later that none of this ever happened. Colbert didn't press beyond that. He didn't need to. The audience had already crossed the threshold where denial transforms into evidence, where trying to erase a connection becomes the clearest proof that the connection mattered. This is how credibility actually dies. Not in scandal, but in inconsistency. Not in accusation, but in comparison. When past and present collide and one of them panics, the late-night format made the moment even more devastating. Comedy is usually a place where power expects ridicule, not recall. Jokes are easy to deflect. Facts are harder. Archives are unforgiving. And when comedy turns archival, it stops being entertainment and starts functioning like testimony. Trump's response followed the script it always follows. Attack the messenger. Dismiss the platform, flood the zone. But the flood didn't work this time because the story wasn't being driven by interpretation. It was being driven by memory. People didn't need to be told what to think. They just needed to be shown what had already happened. That's the danger of visibility for anyone who relies on denial. The more you've been photographed, quoted, recorded, and celebrated, the harder it becomes to pretend you were never there. Fame leaves a footprint, and the deeper the footprint, the harder it is to erase without leaving marks everywhere else. By the end of the segment, Colbert hadn't convicted anyone of anything. He hadn't accused Trump of crimes. He had done something far more corrosive to unchecked power. He demonstrated that Trump's version of events could not coexist with documented reality. That's when denial stops functioning as defense and starts functioning as confession. The show moved on. The audience applauded. Another joke followed, but the damage didn't reset. It lingered. Because once people see the machinery of eraser in action, once they recognize how aggressively history is being rewritten, they start looking backward on their own. And that instinct doesn't turn off. This is why power fears archives more than outrage. Outrage burns fast. Archives wait. They don't chase relevance. They outlast it. And when the moment comes, they don't need embellishment. They only need to be reopened. Trump wanted the public to forget Epstein. Instead, the denial reminded them why forgetting was never an option. Not because of what was alleged, but because of what was already said, already shown, already smiling back from photographs that never asked to be erased. And in the end, that's the cruel irony of denial. The harder you try to erase the past, the louder it announces that it mattered.